I had wanted to get the next assignment set up for today so that I could introduce it, which is the visual identity, and have it set up as an assignment on here, but I've had some chaos going on in our house the last few days, and so I haven't quite got that, but I'll explain it to you, and tomorrow or later I'll set up the assignment with all the requirements for it. But this is the visual identity. So remember that this assignment follows on from the logo design. So you're going to take your logo design on the this is in the wrong one actually. So on the page for today's class, I've added some links. Some of these were there actually on the last one, like the 16 examples of identities. I'd also, in the Tuesday Zoom class, I talked a little bit about color. So there's a link here to the website Color Matters. There's that links that I've shown you previously of the Starbucks visual identity. So I'm not going to go over this again, but I'll just point it out again. And then there's a website here called Branding Style Guides. So this is a really useful resource for researching like what style guides are, and you have to join in. You have to sign up for it, but it's free to sign up for, and then you can download different PDFs of visual identities. So I've downloaded some, and I've added them to the class page. So just to give you some idea, this is the Sony one. This is an outdated visual identity, so it's not quite the latest one, but I think this is from around about 2013, I want to say, something like that. So it's fairly recent. Oh no, actually this one I think is older than that. Yeah, it's an older visual identity, but it still gives you an idea of the visual identity. I think I have to. Let me download it from here because it'll be easier to look at it.
So, okay, so in Illustrator, is there a way to like add in actually it might be Photoshop, to add in like say like a regular picture and then draw on top of it so you can kind of trace it?
Yeah, you do it in Illustrator. Yeah, I'll do a demonstration for it in the class if you want. So on this one, remember that, so this is to give you some guidance as to what I want you to do for the second project. So this is the setup for it. You'll do the setup for this in InDesign with multiple pages. But a lot of the stuff that you create to go into it, you could do in Illustrator. So things, for instance, like color swatches and the versions of the logo and so on, that can all be done in Illustrator. InDesign is really for setting up pages and laying out stuff. So I would use that for creating the actual booklet because it'll be a multi-page PDF. So InDesign lends itself best for creating multi-page documents because it has the pages panel, it allows you to create styles and so on. So this is the first part. It has a brief introduction. These guidelines were created to build a consistent design language for Sony communication. Not all examples and instances will be represented in this guide. Please use your best judgment when building communication pieces. If you have any questions, contact SEL US Corporate Marketing. It's if it's not Sony, it's not the best. That's just a tagline, I think. And then building a foundation. So it has these various sections. Building a foundation. This sort of explains the whole visual identity. 2 is a continuation from that. So it goes over the typography, the color, the photography that you can use for them, how to use those. Then it has building guidelines, single page, double page. This is talking about ads. So single page ad, double page ad, execution, reference, newspaper and special formats, logos, and then environments. So retail stores, online, TV and film. So you can click on one of these particular areas and take you to that section and read a little bit about what it would be. So these guides are given out to designers who are working for Sony. And a company like Sony, which is a massive multinational corporation, will have designers working on stuff around the world. Some of them will be in-house, so some of them will be Sony graphic designers. Some of them will be advertising agencies. Some of them will be freelancers. But they all need to speak in the same voice, so to speak, when they're creating any kind of content, any kind of communication which has the Sony brand. it needs to be a consistent voice, because branding is really to do with trust. It's about creating a sense of trust in the consumer, that they believe that you'll always be around and that you're reliable, and that the products that you produce, you'll back them, and if there's a problem with it, you'll fix it, and that sort of thing.
How do certain companies rebrand?
How do they rebrand?
Yeah.
Well, it's usually a pretty big process. I should make a distinction, first of all, between a brand identity and a visual identity, because they're sort of interchangeable in a sense, but they're not quite. So a brand identity is a bigger thing. A visual identity is a component of the brand identity. So the brand of a company is, you can think of the brand of the company as the way that the company sees itself. So it would have things like a mission statement. It would also describe things like, the type of celebrities that you would associate with and have as your spokesperson. Things which are outside of necessarily the visual aspect of it. They might have things, for instance, like instructions about the kind of voices they might use in radio spots, stuff like that. So that's not your visual identity, but that's still the brand. So the idea of a brand is creating a consistent voice. And you're talking to a variety of different stakeholders. So some of those are customers, obviously, but also some of them are people who are employees or vendors. So you want to create a sense of trust within that whole set of community. So the visual identity is the way visually that you represent that brand and what it speaks for. So here it's talking about Sony style. Interior graphic posters, events islands. Here that you can see that they have this black frame. This is part of their visual identity. So you can see on here that it has this black frame. They refer to it as the open black frame because one side, the right-hand side, is always open. So it has a black frame that goes this way, and it always has the Sony logo, and then it has this tagline at the bottom. Yeah, exactly. So on these visual identity guides, what you're seeing is how do we represent the company? And it's basically a guidebook for somebody who's going to work with Sony so they know how to set it up. There is some, on this one it's kind of interesting because it has some directions at the top here. So it says here, Sony's new color television model was tested in October 1967. After years of intense labor and many sleepless nights, we stood back and watched as the incredibly bright screen overflowed with dynamic color. Everyone could only stare at the screen in silent amazement as Ibuka and top directors arrived breathless in the lab from running through the building. The new Sony Trinitron TV had been born. So this is a reference to their history. Bringing color into the world. When we use color, we aim for maximum emotional impact. The Sony color palette has been carefully crafted to carry this emotional robustness into functionality, appealing design, bringing color into the world, and enriching our emotional lives has long been a core of Sony. So this is some examples. Now they have primarily the way that Sony markets itself is through this particular color. So their main color is Sony Black, which is basically a solid black. But they do have specific specifications for it. So RGB is 0000. CMYK though is a 60. This is kind of interesting, I think. It's not like what you would usually do as a 4-color black. So usually a 4-color black is 50-50, 50-100, or maybe 60-40, 40-100. This one is 60-50, 20-100. So it would tend to be slightly purplish because there's no yellow. There's very little yellow relative to the cyan and the magenta. So it would still look basically black, but it would be cool black rather than a warmer black, I would say. But for all intents and purposes, it's a black, right? So that's their primary focus. Like when you look at the way that they present the logo, it's always in black. And they talk about the text always has to be black or white. So white text on a black background or black text on a white background. That's the only way Sony ever communicates. So this is what this guide is about giving directions as to how you communicate with this brand, how you communicate this brand visually. So there's descriptions for the body copy, for instance. If necessary, body copy on the web can be set using ITC Avantgarde Book, that's their font, Condense. This condensed typeface takes up less of our very limited online screen space. Use this typeface sparingly, never use it for headlines. That's interesting as well, actually, because ITC Avantgarde I don't think is really a screen-based font. You know, it's a font that was designed for print purposes. But their font in general is Avantgarde, so they're using that. Sometimes online you wouldn't be able to specify that font, so they might default to something more like Helvetica or Arial if it's on a PC. But that's the version of it for screen purposes. So this is at 7 point, 9 point, 12 point to give you some idea of what that font looks like at those sizes. But it's the same font as they're using here, except condensed. Condensed means that it's a same font family, but it's designed to take up less space horizontally. So it's not like they're squashing it. A font designer has carefully designed that font to be part of the Avantgarde set, but using the same proportions, only narrowing all the letters down a little bit. Okay. So they're basically giving their designers a little bit of flexibility online, where they could. It seems like a weird choice, by the way, to me, that is, to do a condensed typeface online, because you don't have limited real estate online. Online is actually where you have unlimited real estate. It's on print that you have limited real estate, right? Because in print, you have to pay for each piece of paper that you print. Whereas online, it's basically free for every page that you add to a website or whatever. So I think it's a little bit of a weird description, that one, but it is how they're defining it. So here it describes how they work out the size of that frame and how this tagline fits with it. Like no other, is always at 47% gray. It's always against that black. It lines up with this frame right here. So these red dotted lines are indicating the position, relative positions of these different areas of the design. So I'll leave the Sony one for a second. Oh, I lost the page now. Yeah, this is the second project. So the first project is the logo design, and then your visual identity is going to use that logo design and create a visual identity. So you're extending past what you have as a logo. So the logo is sort of like the cornerstone, if you want, of the visual identity, but it is by far and away not all of it. So the visual identity includes the logo, but also specifications for the logo. So you might have multiple versions of the logo, for instance. You might have a logo which is in color, a logo that's in black and white, maybe one that's in 2 color, one that's in 4 color. You might have one which is vertical, you might have one which is horizontal, and you also want to specify, is the logo, how can the logo be used? So for instance, you might say the logo always has to be against a white background. Or if it's going to be put against an image, it has to be on an image which doesn't have a lot of complexity behind it. Or it can only be against black or white. And if you're going to do it against black, it has to be this particular version of the logo. And if it's against white, it has to be this particular version of the logo. So those are the sorts of specifications you're defining. I'll just show you a couple more. So that was Sony. This is Target. Actually, let me do the Virgin one first. So this is Virgin Atlantic, the airline. So you look at the beginning here, it has brand personality, mission, characteristics, and then examples. Tone of voice, overview, do's and don'ts grammar. I'm not expecting you to do quite as much as this, obviously. There's a whole team of people that went into making these visual identity guides, and they would spend a good amount of time on it, like probably months and months, maybe even a couple of years to produce a full visual identity guide. So I'm not expecting you to have this level of detail in it, but this is just to give you kind of an idea of what one is. So the mission for the brand personality of Virgin is Virgin America makes flying fun again. We're constantly reinventing air travel with our stylish design, award-winning service, and the most advanced entertainment system in the sky. Rather than accept the traditional rules of air travel, we're breaking from convention to create the most incredible airline in the industry. We thrive on doing things differently and turning heads along the way. By pushing the boundaries of what's possible at 35,000 feet, we're creating an experience like no other. So that's their mission. Characteristics. Our personality is a blend of three characteristics: clever, provocative, and friendly. Depending on the medium, emphasis may shift to one characteristic over the others. For example, advertising headlines generally skew clever and provocative, while email subject lines tend to be friendly. Here are more details on what we mean by each. Clever, as in smart, cheeky, and witty. Not pretentious. It's about having fun with words, not sounding cooler than thou. Provocative, as in bold and unconventional, not obscene or offensive. We're provocative in how we challenge the industry and motivate other airlines to keep up. Friendly. This serves as a reminder that guests are always at the center of what we do, and it helps take the edge off of our provocative nature. Examples. So here they're giving you some visual examples about the way that they can present their theme. All of this stuff that we're talking about here, by the way, is the brand more than the visual identity. Okay, so when we get into the visual identity, it's a little bit further down here. So there's a guide to grammar, for instance. This is not really part of the visual identity, it's more part of the brand identity. Do's and don'ts. Again, this is brand identity. But when we get down to the logo, now we're really talking about the visual identity. So you can see that from this, these are various examples of their logo. The main logo is this one. This is our preferred logo. It should be used whenever possible and never be altered. So it also specifies a minimum size for print, or is that really true? 15 inches print? That seems very large. And then 75 points for the web. And then there's a vertical version of their logo, or the stacked version of their logo. The two components, the symbol and then the logo type, use slightly different logo variations. So these are what are acceptable versions of the logo. This is the straightforward black with red version. This is the one with a black background. This is one where it's all red. This is all red but reversed out. This is all black. This is all black but reversed out. So those are how you can do the logo, different versions of logo in different situations. So if you're working for Virgin America making designs, those are your options. Here it talks about the word mark and the clear space. This clear space around the outside, it means that you can't have anything that gets any closer than that. And this measurement is the height of the X height in the lettering. That's duplicated all the way around the letters from the top of the X height and from the bottom of the baseline to form that sort of square clear space around the outside. Most logo designs will create a clear space like that so that logos don't have anything butting up against them. Here's incorrect logo types. Oftentimes in visual identities, it'll put warnings about how not to use the logo. So here's one where it says, the first one, 01, don't stretch the logo disproportionately. The logo shouldn't be altered, so don't squash it, don't stretch it. The logo shouldn't be a different color. Don't alter the logo's color. If you make Virgin America this blue, it's a completely different company. It no longer stands up. You don't recognize it as easily. So it always has to be consistent. That's what we're really striving for more than anything else with this type of design, is trying to establish a way to be consistent with the designs. Don't put it at an angle. You can imagine that some young designer go, oh, I know, it'd be a great idea for this. We can make it look like an aeroplane if I have it going up at an angle. But it doesn't fit with the overall visual identity. It's out of character with the company. It's kind of silly rather than clever. And then this one, don't mess with the space between those. So this is number 4. They describe this as don't alter the internal spacing of the logo. Don't use the logo over a distracting background. Don't put effects on the logo. Basically, don't do anything to it. And this is true of almost all logos. When you create a visual identity, it needs to be consistent. So usually you won't change logos. There are some exceptions to that. So for instance, MTV in the 1980s kind of broke this rule quite famously by every time they would show the MTV logo, it was a different pattern or coloring that was going on inside of it. That was a radical break in logos at the time, that idea of modifying your logo. Google have done a similar thing on their Google website. So every time you go to the Google website, they'll have an illustration, right, for a particular event that's playing with that logo. Didn't mean to do that. I meant to actually go to Google. So they'll oftentimes play with this, right, so that you have like a different logo here. They stopped doing that now. All of a sudden, I was expecting it to be something different. Yeah, they'll have like an artist design. There's one guy actually that designs a lot of those, but they have had special artist design ones for it. Yeah, and they'll have like animated ones or something, interactive stuff. So, but that's unusual. Generally speaking, most logos you don't change them. You use them in a very consistent way, and you don't change them. So this is their other color palette. They have these primary colors. So they've got the main red color, which is pretty obvious. They've got this dark gray that they use. Again, if you look at the specifications, these are very particular specifications. So you've got the hexadecimal code. These are all different ways of referencing the same color, by the way. So this is the CMYK breakdown. It's 7% cyan, 100% magenta, 100% yellow, 1% black. This is Pantone 485C. That's if you're going to print a spot color, an individual ink color that's not made out of dots of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. You would use that. RGB is for screen graphics, and it has a breakdown of the RGB. But this would all make that basically that same color, okay? And then this dark gray has the breakdowns and so on. So these are their main colors that they use all the time, and then they have these secondary colors. Like for instance, this silver and gold, I think they use it on one of their loyalty reward things, you know, that type of thing. Then it has the breakdown of typography. So the other thing I want you to do for the visual identity is break down and explain how your particular company is going to use type. What fonts do they use? So here it says that Virgin America, the primary typeface is this one called Gotham. And they have four weights of that. They have light and thin. So that's light, that's thin. This is black, and this is medium. How many of you have done a typography class? Is there anybody that's done typography as a subject yet? Okay, let me explain a little bit about typography, and I'll go over more about this in the next Zoom meeting, and I'll give you some more information about it. But basically, there are two main strands of typography, two types of type. There are sans serif typefaces, which sans is a French word which means without. It's spelled S-A-N-S. People in the States tend to pronounce it as sans, but it's a French word, and so it would be pronounced sans. But it means without, so it's without serifs. I think all of the Virgin visual identity is sans serif typography, so I can't show you a serif one, I don't think, here. So these are alternates. These are for online purposes. So the reason that they have these online versions is that certain fonts are automatically on systems, and so they're readily available, like in websites and so on. It's getting easier for you to be able to pick fonts, even when you're designing websites, and then have them accessible to everybody. But there are certain situations online where you don't really have a choice of the font, and so these are the fonts that you would kind of default to. Verdana is a font which was designed specifically for screen purposes. It was designed for the internet. And then Helvetica. Helvetica wasn't, but it's probably the most common sans serif typeface. And then you can break down sans serif and serif typefaces into other categories. So sans serif typefaces, there's what are called humanist typefaces, like Gil Sans. So humanist typefaces have this kind of relationship to calligraphy. They almost look, they have references to like a serif typeface, only it doesn't have any serifs on it. So they have more of a kind of calligraphic quality to them. Then you have what are called grotesque. fonts. Grotesque is another version of sans serif. So Helvetica, this bottom one, would be considered a grotesque font. It tends to be, first of all, the thickness all the way around is very much the same. It doesn't have that calligraphic quality. It's much more mechanical. And it also has these sort of squared off rounded shapes rather than it being a complete circle. It's got a kind of rounding off a squared shape in a sense in these sort of forms. And then you also get fonts which are called geometric. Futura would be a geometric font, where if you look at the O, it's basically an exact circle. The other letter forms, like the letter A, is basically a triangle. It's all based off of very simple geometry. So understanding a little bit about that detail and those classifications and history of fonts can help you determine which fonts you would use for a particular company, right? So if you think of it like this, you can think of fonts either in terms of flavor, perhaps, or you could think of them in terms of style. So, for instance, if somebody goes to an event and they're wearing a suit, it makes a certain statement about that person. You know, a suit is on a guy. It's a very kind of like buttoned down presentation. So it's demanding a certain amount of respect, and it also has a sense of power to it. So fonts can do the same sort of thing. Depending on how you dress up the design with different fonts, you can make it feel like it's serious, that it has gravitas, that it's stylish, that it's cool, or you can make it feel like it's friendly, or that it's quirky, or that it's interesting. You know, so each font has its own personality. So when choosing fonts, I want you to look at them quite carefully and analyze them. I will also in the next class talk a little bit about the anatomy of fonts, because if you can start to break the fonts down into parts, like for instance, this hole in a letter form is called a counter. This one at the bottom of the capital letter A is called an open counter. This one's called a closed counter. So it doesn't really matter that you know those terms, but if you know those terms and you read about typography or you watch YouTube videos about typography, it can help you to have a better understanding. Also, when you have a label for something, it's easier for you to notice it. So the fact that a letter has an ear on it, or it has a teardrop on it, you can look at that and go, okay, so that must be an old style font, or that's a transitional font. And by knowing these certain categories, an old style font has a kind of humanist quality to it. It feels like it's made by the human hand, and it has a relationship to that. Whereas a transitional font, which comes a little bit later, so the old style fonts start around the 1500s, transitional fonts start around the 1700s, and it's to do with the development of the Industrial Revolution. Transitional fonts are more mechanical looking. And then when you get to modern fonts, which starts a little bit later on, the early 1800s, those fonts are much more mechanical and more refined. So they have very thin serifs. By choosing those, like those look good in magazines, for instance, especially like high class, like fashion magazines, like Elle or something like that, Vogue. Those kind of fonts, Didone, they're sometimes referred to, or modern fonts. So if you were to look up type classifications, you can go down this rabbit hole for a few years. But if you just get a basic understanding of the idea of these different type classifications, so you've got these two main ones, right? Serif typefaces and sans serif typefaces. Then you have script typefaces and decorative typefaces. Script typefaces come in different forms, like formal tends to be used for things like weddings. It's very flowing, and it's based off of beautiful handwriting. These come around in the 1700s, and they're partly cultural and they're partly technical. So the reason that they started having script typefaces is the invention of copperplate printing. It enables you to make these very, very thin lines in printing, which you couldn't really very easily do before. And then also at that same time, particularly women who were in aristocracy would hire people who were scribes or specialists in handwriting to teach them how to do beautiful handwriting, because it was a sign of being refined. And so there's a sense of script typefaces being about refinement and elegance and romance, and they're kind of romantic. Casual scripts are different. They feel more like advertising. So they look a little bit more like they're done with a brush oftentimes. And they don't have the same formal quality. They don't have the same romance about them. They seem more like they're trying to sell you something. And then calligraphic is based off of calligraphic pens, so they have thicks and thins in them. Black letter and Lombardic is like Gothic lettering. You know? And then decorative fonts, grunge, psychedelic, graffiti. These are kind of like a big mixture. Decorative fonts could be all sorts of things. You would never use these, though, as part of a visual identity, like for body copy or something, because they're really for very specific purposes. So very rarely would a decorative font be a part of your visual identity. It could possibly be, but it could be part of your logo, but less likely be part of the type specifications, because for things like body copies and headings and subheadings and captions, you want something which is legible at small sizes or at reasonable sizes. These tend to work in very specific purposes. So grunge fonts are ones that they've taken a font usually and then messed with it, chopped it up, made it look like it's got a texture to it, kind of broken it a little bit, as if it's been printed and then cut up. And so these are good for certain situations if you're trying to express that idea. If you're trying to express the idea of grunge. Psychedelic fonts are fonts which are designed sort of like 1960s hippie kind of era, and they're usually quite difficult to read. But having a basic understanding of these can really help you to get an idea. So it has that breakdown. Here it shows you what they are. So this is a serif typeface. This is an old style typeface. Bembo is one example. Berkeley old style. Centaur, ITC legacy serif. These are all what are called old style typefaces. Garamond would be another example. Caslon would be another. Actually, Caslon I think might be a transitional font. And then you've got transitional fonts. Americana, Baskerville, Bulmer, Perpetua. On the surface, these seem very similar because they're both serif typefaces. And it is, for the untrained eye, it's very difficult to tell the difference between a old style typeface and a transitional typeface. The thing that I want you to try to appreciate with typography is the subtlety of the differences. So if you look at these serifs on this one, they're a little more square. These are a little bit more rounded usually on old style typeface. The other thing which is almost always a difference is what's called the bias. So this bias actually, that line, to be honest with you, is going the wrong way. The bias here is this way. So it's the thin parts of the letter form is what defines the bias. So if you were to draw a line through the thinnest part here and the thinnest part here, it would go sort of like that. And it usually has an angle which leans back on its up to the left. If you look at a transitional font, it has a vertical bias. So the thin part of the letter at the top and the bottom are in line with each other. The other thing which is different is if you look at the top of the serif, what's called the cap serif, this part of it is fairly straight here, whereas on the old style typeface, it tends to lean back down a little bit. So if you read through it, it'll give you a stronger description of what the difference is. But these are both serif typefaces, but they have a different feel. This is more humanistic. It's more friendly. It's not as easy to read, actually. And then this one is a little bit more rigid, a little bit more mechanical. And then when you get down to these next ones, here it refers to them as neoclassical or Didoni serifs. They are sometimes also referred to as modern typefaces. So I think in here it actually discusses the fact that they're also sometimes referred to as modern typefaces. These are late 18th century, so it's sort of height of the Industrial Revolution, and the revolution was really getting going. And again, the big difference here is there's a greater contrast between the thicks and the thins. So the thin are very thin, the thick are very thick relative to the serifs have no bracketing. Bracketing is that curving that you get here from the serif up into the stem of the letter form. This one, you notice, doesn't have that at all. It just goes, it's just basically a straight line. So some modern typefaces have a little bit of bracketing, but it's usually very slight if it has any. This one, as you can see, doesn't have any. The reason that they're called Didoni, by the way, is that it's a mixture of the word Bodoni and another font which is called Didot, which is a French version. So Bodoni is Italian, Udo is a French version, and they look somewhat similar to each other. They have those same kind of sensibility. Slab serifs look like sans serifs with big slab serifs with big chunky serifs stuck on the end of it. Again, vertical bias. The serifs are just square. This is a Clarendon serif, so a little bit more rounded again. We've got a little bit more brackets. Glyphic serifs. These ones feel more calligraphic, so they've got like a sort of very flowing curve out. It's almost like rather than a serif, it feels more like a splayed sans serif. And then we go into the sans serif type. So grotesque, Franklin Gothic, Helvetica, News Gothic, Universe. These tend to feel quite neutral. So these are the first commercially popular sans serif typefaces. Contrast in stroke weight is most apparent in these styles. There is a slight squared quality to many of the curves, and several designs have the bowl and loop lowercase g common to Roman typefaces. In some cases, the R has a curled leg. So the curled leg will be here. What it's talking about here, the loop and bowl, is this. So this has a loop here and then a bowl here. This is sometimes referred to as either a two-story or a double-decker G. And that's quite distinctive of this style, although you also get that in a humanist sans serif like Gil Sans, actually. Square sans serif, Eurostyle, Neo Sans, geometric serifs, geometric sans serifs. These tend to be very round, very square, very triangular, like geometric shapes. So you see the O is a perfect circle. The R looks like it's based off of a perfect circle, unlike, say, this one, which is more squared. That gives it a very different personality. These types, these geometric fonts, it doesn't talk about this here, but I would suggest that these tend to work really well if you want to put across the idea of something being very simple. So like IKEA, for instance, uses a geometric sans serif typeface in a lot of its publications. It wants to put across the idea that this is simple. It's also sometimes used in things that are aimed at kids because it's like primary colors, red, yellow, blue, sans serif typeface with no fancy little serify bits, and also a geometric sans serif. So the O is like a circle. It's all very simple. So this is one of the things that I want you to do, is to specify the typefaces, and you also specify how they're used. So overview, typography. The Virgin America primary typeface Gotham was chosen to reinforce and accentuate the clean and modern aesthetic that has become a hallmark in everything the airline does. The font family includes a variety of different weights, from ultra to thin, allowing for a flexible range when building a hierarchy in messaging. Headlines, for example, are usually in light, whereas subhead could be set in black for increased emphasis, especially at smaller sizes. We use the typeface across all branding and marketing materials, with a few exceptions on the web. In cases where our typeface is unavailable, there are appropriate substitutions which are outlined in section 3.10. For access to the Gotham typeface, contact design at Virgin America. So this is telling you basically they're using really this one font, and they have these various weights that you can use: the light, the thin, the black, and the medium. I believe Gotham actually has more weights than that, but that's the ones that they have that are part of it. So does anybody have questions about that? Those are the two main things that you're going to add in this visual identity, is specifying the color and then specifying the typography. But I also want you to create some additional supporting graphics. So one of the things that you might want to create is a repeat pattern. I'm going to do a demonstration for creating a repeat pattern in Illustrator based off of your visual identity. Sorry, say that again. A repeat pattern? Yeah, pattern, yeah. We pronounce T's in England as T's, and in America you pronounce them as D's, so it oftentimes throws people. Pattern, right? Yeah, 2 goals. And he scored against Leipzig, although we lost against them, but he scored before. They played in the Champions League against, no, not Leipzig, against Young Boys, the Swiss team. and they were winning 1-0, and then Wan-Bissaka got sent off for a nasty challenge. Lost 2-0, 2-1. Oh well. Oh really? Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. They said that when he first entered the stadium, that the roar from the crowd registered on Richter scales about 2 miles away from the stadium. All right, so if you want to create a repeat pattern in Illustrator, it's got a great tool for doing this. A repeat pattern is something, you might use this for a variety of different purposes. You could actually get a career in doing surface design. So surface design will be used for things like fabrics. You might also use it for carpets, anything which, linoleum, all sorts of surfaces have repeat patterns on them. And there are people who specialize in doing surface design. But as graphic designers, we also quite oftentimes end up having to create repeat patterns. I've worked for a clothing company where I used to create repeat patterns for like the inside lining of the suits and things like that. And then we'd create repeat patterns for packaging sometimes. So the inside of the packaging would have a repeat on it, that type of thing. And it could be really out of anything. So it could be out of typography, it could be out of shapes. But usually there's a square at the basis of it. So I'm going to put a square color to begin with. And let's change that ugly color. And then I'm going to add some shapes over the top of it. So I'm going to keep it fairly simple to begin with, because I just want you to get the idea of how you can go about approaching it. So I'm just, in Illustrator, I'm just drawing with the basic shape tools here, like the ellipse tool, just dragging out shapes. I'm also going to use the polygon tool. I'm going to use this to make a triangle. So as I drag out with the polygon tool, if I use the arrows on the keyboard, like the down arrow, for instance, will allow me to take sides away, so I can create a triangle. If I use the up arrow, it will increase the number of sides on the polygon. Once you've created it, you can actually change the number also by putting your cursor over this little diamond. You see how it has a plus minus? So if I click on that, we can also modify it there. For some reason it's not letting me. Yeah. There we go. So I can add or subtract sides that way also after the fact, after I've created the shape. But I just want to create a triangle here. I'm going to squash this down a little bit. Let's change the color of that one. And I'll rotate it a little bit also. One nice new feature in Illustrator, I think it was like a couple of versions ago, is that when you draw a shape now, it automatically has this bounding box around the outside of it. So you can rotate it by putting your cursor just outside the corner like that. You can rotate it, and you could scale it by dragging from the corner. I'm holding Shift to constrain the proportions. So I'm just going to move a few of these around, and then let's try repeating it now. So this feature that they have in Illustrator was brought out quite a few versions ago. But I remember I used to do repeat patterns prior to this feature. And the way that you used to do it is you would create a tile like this, drag it into the swatches panel, and then you'd apply it as a pattern. So you drag it into the swatches, make it into a pattern, and then you can apply it and see what it looks like. And then if you want to change it, you'd have to drag it out, make some modifications to it, drag it back in, and then see what it looks like. Now you can see it on the fly. So if you go Object, and then choose Pattern, and then choose Make, and then press OK, you can see what that pattern looks like when it's repeating. But also, more importantly, I can easily offset it. Most repeat patterns are offsets. So this is a brick by row offset. This is a brick by column offset. So it's basically taking, you see this circle if it wasn't offset, would line up exactly with this. So they look like they're soldiers in a row, you know. This makes it a little bit more natural by doing that. You can also offset it by a third rather than by a half and that kind of thing. So this was one of the things that in traditional, like if you were doing surface design as a career years ago, like if you were a fabric designer, for instance, one of the key technical things that you would need to know, and you imagine doing this by hand, you'd have to work out how to create an offset. So you would draw these. Imagine doing a floral design, and you've got to take this whole floral design and then replicate it down over here, half offset, so that it all merges. And when you see it as a whole, that's quite skilled. But with this feature in Illustrator, you can very easily create offsets. Once you're happy with the design, by the way, when you're in here and you're operating this, you can still duplicate these objects to change the design. I could put one on the side like this, and you'll see that it still duplicates it. If I put it on this side, it's actually getting cut off. But I could change the side that gets cut off by clicking here. It's just a screen tweak. Oh no, you know what that is that this one would also need to go there. So there's those two offsets. Either the overlap is on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, or it's at the top or the bottom. So you can change that here. And so by using that, you can make it feel like there is no edge. That's ideally what you're creating, is the sense that that's a continuous repeating pattern, and there's no edge to it. There is another feature. Yeah, question? Yeah, what? Sorry? Yeah, like wrapping paper, exactly. Yeah. In fact, when I first moved to the States, I had a company which made greeting cards, and I never actually did make wrapping paper. But I started researching. It's really expensive to print wrapping paper because you have to print a lot to make it viable. So I didn't end up doing it, but I did get into the point of like testing out doing different gift wrap stuff. Well, there could be profit in it, but you've got to make a lot of it to make it cheap enough to be able to sell. And so the initial cost up front is quite a lot because you got to buy however many thousand rolls of it, and then you've got to be able to sell that stuff, of course. So there's no guarantee until you've established it. It's a little tricky. Okay, once you're happy with it, I would hit done here. And then what happens is that this gets stored in the swatches panel over here. So this is the pattern that I've created. I can delete this now because if I ever wanted the pattern again, I can just drag it out of the swatches and we've got that shape. If you wanted to keep it here, so it's simpler, you could just keep that over to the side. But now if I want to use the pattern, I can draw a shape that I want to fill with that pattern and then click on it and it will fill that shape, whatever the shape is. So this is a rectangle, but it could be any shape. So you can put that pattern inside any shape. Also, if you double click and scale, there's a feature in here where it says transform objects, transform patterns. So if I take transform objects off and scale this, say 50%, I could scale the pattern 50% without scaling the object. You could also do the same thing with the rotate tool. So if I double click on the rotate tool and said 45 degrees, say, but have transform objects unchecked, I can rotate the angle of the pattern. So in this case, it doesn't make a lot of difference, but you can change the way it looks. It doesn't look so, the rows are so vertical, It all has a little bit more of an organic sort of feel to it. So it's pretty easy, I think, to if you want to try making a pattern, all you've got to do is create some kind of a square of color. It doesn't actually have to have the square, by the way, because it will automatically develop a square for you if you don't make one. But if you don't put a square there, your background is going to be transparent because it will make a square based off of whatever shapes you have there, and everything around it will be a transparent space. But if you don't, you can play around with this. I think it's a really fun exercise to try making a series of patterns and then see if you can implement them in some way into your design. So, I could do this. If I make this very small, object, pattern, make, and then again we can press OK here. Again, afterwards, if I want to, I can offset it like that, or I could offset it like this. So I'm going to leave this as a grid and press done. But there I've created another pattern that I could use. So as part of your visual identity, as a supporting graphic for your visual identity, as well as your logo and what kind of colors you're going to use, you could create a series of different patterns, or maybe one pattern or a couple of patterns, because I would like you to add some other supporting graphics to go along with it. Another example of supporting graphics for a brand would be something like a character design. So for instance, McDonald's has their McDonald's M, but they also have like the Hamburglar. I don't think they use those very much anymore, but they did have these characters for a while. And there are other companies that use characters as part of their visual identity guide. You might also use things like certain graphic stripes, or like Adidas use those 3 stripes, which is part of their logo, but they also use those 3 stripes in lots of different situations as a kind of supporting graphic. So look at other examples of what you could use to bolster the design of your visual identity. Yeah. Which brand is that? Adidas. Oh yeah. So they have a repeat pattern with the Adidas logo. Is it like this type of thing? Yeah. They have one here where they're using the logo upside down and the right way up. I imagine, to be honest with you, with this one, that this might be a counterfeit one that's not real Adidas. I'm not sure about that, but it seems weird that they're using the logo upside down. I would have thought that would have been a no-no for them, but maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, usually it would be. Yeah, you wouldn't show it like that, but it might be that they allow it. That's kind of an interesting one as well, where they have the logo overlapping. With this type of thing, where you start to do T-shirts as well, where the brand becomes the design, you oftentimes have a little bit more flexibility with it. So the logo you could do sort of distortions of the logo, but that again depends on the way that you've defined it in the visual identity guide. Let me go back to the class symbol for a second. Oh, I was also going to take a look at working with gradients in Illustrator. So this kind of goes along with the idea of color. In the last class, I talked about color. It could be that as part of your visual identity, as well as having individual colors, you could specify particular gradients. So I thought I'd go over how you can use gradients in a couple of different ways. So first of all, technically, how you produce a gradient in Illustrator. So if I select down here at the bottom of the tool panel, you can see that I have 3 choices. There's one which is for flat color, and there's one which is for a gradient, and then there's one here which is for none. So if I choose that basic gradient, if I double click on the gradient tool, I'll get the gradient panel, and we can then modify it. You could also maybe get a gradient from the swatches panel. So if you open up your swatches panel, there could already be some basic gradients in there, like this one right here is a black-white gradient. We've got an orange-yellow gradient here. And if you go to the swatch library right here, you can also choose books of gradients. So if we choose, let me see, gradients, you've got a whole list of different gradients here. So let's say, just take a look at one of them. So if we go to earth tones, for instance, these are all gradients based off of earth tones. They're all created in the same way, and you can modify any of them. So if you want to modify it, a gradient has a couple of different options at the very top. So if you look at the gradient panel right here, we have linear gradient, we have radial gradient, which looks like this, And then you also have this new feature, or relatively new feature, I think this was brought in about 3 versions ago, where you can do a freeform gradient. So if you click on this, what it's doing is it's creating these various points which you can move around. And if you put them very close together, you'll almost create kind of like an edge. But if they have some distance, they create a subtle transition of tone. So this is great for creating like really soft looking continuous tone gradients that don't feel so mechanical. They have a more organic sort of feel to them. If you want to also, you can add additional points. And you can also take points off by dragging them out of it. If I click there, there's another point. So that's a freeform gradient. If I do a linear gradient, it goes in one direction, and I can drag the direction like this. If I drag from here to here, you can see that this is what's called the gradient annotator. And it's an exact replica of that. So I can either look at it here and adjust the position of the gradient, or I can adjust it here. It makes no difference. It's the same thing. In fact, if I adjust this, you can see that one also being adjusted. But I don't necessarily have to use all the gradients. So if I drag the gradient from there, for instance, I'm only using sort of like this portion of the gradient right now. I'm not using the whole gradient. So it becomes a subtler transition from one color to the other. If you're doing a radial gradient, you have similar kind of controls. This gradient slider here, if you want to duplicate one of these points, you can hold Option, just like duplicating an object, and you can create another tab. If you want to get rid of one of these tabs, you can drag down to remove it. So then that one disappears. If you want to change the color of it, you can double click on it, and then you'll get this color panel. You can switch it to swatches or color panel. You can also switch to different color modes by going to the pull down on the side. This panel is exactly the same as the panel that you'd find under Window Color. It's exactly the same panel. It's just the way that you're accessing it is through the gradient. And if you choose this one, the swatches, this is exactly the same as this swatches panel, except that you're accessing it through the gradient. It won't include things like patterns, but if I double click on here, I can choose any of the flat colors. So I could switch this to that purple, and I could double click on this one and switch it to, say, this pink. Here right now it says that it's 100%, so this is a circle, but I could squash that as well. So it becomes an ellipse. You can also squash it by squashing the shape if you have it set to squash that way. So if I have transform patterns, transform objects, actually that bit isn't under there. It's under, I have to look at that now. Forgot where that is. Where is that? Gradient. I'll have to come back to that. I forgot where that is now. There is a setting where you can set the gradient to be transformed or not transformed when you squash something, when you transform something. But I don't see it right now. But you can also squash it here as well. You can change the angle also here. So you can see that it's like that. But you can also change the angle by using the gradient tool and dragging it in a different direction. You can also squash it visually like this by using this circle around the outside. And you can also pull this further by dragging that, if I can grab it. So you can make this longer or shorter. I'll give you an example of how you might use gradients that you may not have expected. So you can use gradients as a way to create a sense of three-dimensional form. I'll give you an example. I'm going to draw a cylinder. We'll draw it initially. I'm going to have you do this along with me if you want as an exercise. So we draw a cylinder. I start off with an ellipse like that, and I'm duplicating it by dragging it down. And then I'm going to draw a rectangle. And I'm going to go from that anchor point across to this anchor point. So we have a rectangle that completely fits in, covering up the top half of this ellipse and the bottom half of that ellipse. With these two shapes, I'm going to use Shape Builder and join them together. I could also use Pathfinder Unite. And then I'm going to send these to back. So now I have an I have a cylindrical shape. If I was to apply a simple gradient to these, and then I adjust the gradient a little bit. So in the gradient panel, this one is going around the outside of the shape, so the highlight would probably be in a little bit from the edge, and there'd probably some gray as it starts to go back around. So particularly if it's a sort of shiny metallic thing, that highlight would be pretty obvious. It might be less obvious on something where it's a softer, like a more of a matte surface. And then with this shape here at the top, I'm going to drag the gradient just sort of straight across it and keep it fairly short. So I'm only actually showing this part of the gradient. This means that the gradient across the top is very subtle. I don't need the stroke around the outside because the form can be held up just by the chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is shading. If I wanted this metal rod or whatever it is to have a hole in it, I could take this shape, double click on the scale tool, set it to say 50%, hit copy, eyedropper this gradient and drag the gradient in the opposite direction. So using the gradient tool, I would drag it like that. So now it feels like that's got a hole in it, right? If I was to take this shape, actually take this one and move it up, you'll see now it feels like it has a sort of rounded cap on it with the hole because of the position of that. And we could also make it have like a little bevel. So if I copy this shape, copy, paste in front, and then I'll scale it just slightly smaller. So maybe let's do 98%. And I'll nudge it up just slightly. And then the one that was there originally, the one that's slightly bigger, I'm going to redirect the gradient a little bit. So that way it creates like a little chamfer along the edge, as if the edge of it has been kind of rounded off slightly. So you see how with just use of gradients, you can start to get a real sense of something having some dimension to it. If you were to do it against a circle, so if I wanted to make something which looks spherical, I can draw a circle, then change this to a radial gradient. You want the highlight now to be at the front. You want the shadow to maybe not quite so black, so let's make it like a dark gray. And then I'm going to take some of this gray and put it there, so it's slightly lighter there. And then if I drag the gradient from about a 3/4 point towards the top out, it'll start to feel more like a kind of ball shape. And this would cast a shadow, obviously. So if I drew another ellipse underneath it like this and made this a kind of dark gray color, not a gradient, but that's just a solid color, send this to back, and then make another ellipse, which is a bit bigger. Send this to back, and change this one to white, and then choose the blend tool. The blend tool will allow you to blend from one shape to another. So if I blend between those two shapes, we'd get a subtle transition from the ball casting a shadow onto that surface. This shadow wouldn't work very well if the background was a different color because it ends in white. So like if I was to put a color behind this, the shadow would start to look a little bit weird. But if I change the blending mode on the shadow, so I select that blend by double clicking with the group selection tool, I can then go to Window, Transparency. It's open somewhere. Let's see it. Oh, here it is. It's hiding. So if I go to the Transparency panel and change the blending mode to Multiply, it will then fit with that yellow which is underneath it, and it will make it feel more like it's on that surface. And then if I was to take this and put it into perspective, it would feel like that's more like a three-dimensional surface that it's sitting on. With this one, this bottom edge right here is reflected light, right? So the light's coming down here, it's bouncing off this surface and bouncing back up onto the ball. So this gradient actually might want to have a little bit of yellow in it. So what I would do is open up the gradient panel, take this tab, double click on it, go to the color area and just add a little touch of yellow into it. So it'll make it feel like it's reflecting the color of the surface that it's sitting on. All right, I think that's enough for right now for the demonstrations. I did record this, so I'll post it after the class. I realize that's kind of a lot to absorb all at once. So the other thing I wanted to go over just briefly is I'd like to see where you've got with the logo projects. So has anybody got something they want to share in the class that you've uploaded to the project yet for Project 1, the logo design? Go into the. Have you put it into the project already? Okay, I'll take a look. So Aldrich, you have some sketches here, right? Have you started working on them in Illustrator at all yet?
Not too much of the Illustrator.
Okay.
Not much more than the first one.
Okay. And then, where are you at with Illustrator? I can't remember now from when we first talked about this, but how are your Illustrator skills? You're brand new to it?
Yeah,
pretty new to it. Okay. So I think we talked about yours a little bit before, but one suggestion I have on some of these, like with the lettering, for instance, there's something nice on yours about this lettering being hand-drawn. So if you were to hand draw this with like a brush pen or something, and then image trace it, so scan it and then image trace it. I think I'd done a demonstration last time where we took a piece of type that I'd drawn by hand, and then I image traced it. Do you remember that?
Slightly, yeah.
Let me see if I can do this one actually. Let me see which one would be best to do. I can show you what I mean anyway.
Yeah, the last page is
Yeah, like this one, right? So if I take this, I'm going to do so I'm going to open this in Illustrator, and then when it opens in Illustrator, it would actually be better if it had more contrast. So I could open it in Photoshop, but let's see how we get on with it. So if I select this and go up to the top here in the options bar, we have this thing called image trace. The idea of this is it converts what's called a bitmap image, so something which is made out of pixels like this. It converts that into a nice crisp vector. So to do that, I click on image trace. I'm going to choose silhouettes for this. Press OK. It's making it completely black because it doesn't have enough contrast in it. But if I click on this icon right here, in the image trace panel, I can adjust the threshold down. So less of the black will show through. So that way we'll get closer to the type. And I can keep adjusting that until I get it as close as I can to what I want. Once you're happy with it, you can go ahead and hit expand, and now it's literally a vector. So at this point, it has anchor points and all that kind of stuff that you can use to modify the shapes even further. So I can get rid of all this junk that's around the outside. And right now, all of this will be grouped. So I might want to ungroup the whole thing and then group specific areas. So like maybe group this one. so that I can work with that by itself. And then group this one. So Command G or Control G on a PC is the keyboard shortcut for grouping, but it's Object Group, Command G. And then I'll select this one and group it, Command G. Now if we wanted to modify these further, there's a lot of ways that we can alter the way that they look. I'll just I'll leave this one for right now because I think out of the two, these are the two that I prefer. So I'm just going to take this one and put it here. So if I wanted to modify these now, we could do things like, let's say I wanted to clean the path. If you select it, you could go to Object, Path, Simplify, and this will reduce the number of anchor points. So by reducing the number of anchor points, it will become smoother. So you could end up having it be like totally smooth like that. But part of the reason for doing it this way, where you image trace it, is that we retain some of the kind of hand-drawn quality. So it may be that you don't want to do that. But we can also move each individual letter around. So maybe that you like the overall look of it, but we could refine the way that they interact. So for instance, if I take this section, maybe that letter A should join up to the F, you know, so that it feels like that's a continuous stroke. Maybe the T needs to go a little bit closer, and the Y maybe needs to go slightly closer. It's a bit tricky selecting some of this stuff. If you're having a hard time selecting some of them because they're close to other things as well, you can use this lasso tool to kind of drag around a shape like that, and then go back to another selection tool to actually select it. But this way you can really kind of fine-tune how those letters relate to each other. Maybe the F fits into here. If you think of it kind of like doing a jigsaw puzzle, except there isn't specifically a one place where things could go, but what you're trying to do is make the various pieces of your design fit together in a cohesive manner. Like it feels like that's one thing, that they're supposed to be like that they've always supposed to be like that since the beginning of time. You know, that's what you're going for. I'm getting a little bit carried away there maybe, but you know what I mean. So that would be one approach of doing it. You could draw them. You know, you could trace over the top of the letters as well. That would be another way. Is you take your designs that you've done, and you place it, and then you trace over the lettering. That will be another approach. I think I did a demo for how to do a ribbon shape before, right? Did I go over that with you? Yeah. Okay. Do you remember that, Aldrich? I can show you this real quick. So let's say I wanted to do this one. If I wanted to create that ribbon shape, actually, I think I started when the demonstration that I did was a little bit different from this one, but I started with a rectangle actually, and then modified it. So like, let's say I wanted to create a ribbon like this, which goes back on itself. You've basically got these various shapes. If I start with a rectangle here, this would be more like if I wanted to keep it very consistent, because this way I could use the same kind of shape down here as well, like so it's the same thickness, and then I can modify the curves into it afterwards. So with this one, for instance, I can add a point at the end, pull this in a little bit, and then take this shape, and I could do Object, Envelope, Distort, Make with Warp, and I could give it a little bit of a curve like that. This is arc. You could also try arch. The difference is that the edges will be straight now on this one. Once I've got to that point and I've bent it how I want, I can expand it, Object Expand. Now, when I expand this, you've got to be careful. Sometimes it might also expand the stroke. Let's see if it did. No, it didn't actually in this case. So I've got that one shape. I can then rotate this to a slightly different angle. I think it should have bent a little bit further, but I could take this shape here and just pull these handles further and do the same on this side. I think at this end it would want to curve up a little bit. So if I added a point here, I could make this point go sort of like that. And then I could do the same thing here. So I'd add a point there. This is keeping the shape in the right position. Then that way when I do this, it's going from that point rather than from over here. So it'll make a more flowing kind of curve. And then once I've got that piece, I would have another piece behind here. I could do this with the pen tool, or I could draw another rectangle and bend it. But let's say I just did this as a curve like that. If I wanted the same curve again, I could literally duplicate it. So I'm going to change this to a black stroke and then drag it across like this. Let me bring that down a little bit more. So this changes slightly here. I'm going to bring this up. Here I'll curve it slightly back on itself. So here I want to try to get rid of that curve. So I'm going to add a point here, add a point there, and take that one out. So we get rid of that like little sharp corner. So it all flows into each other. I want to bring this one down just a little bit more. Okay, now I've got that shape. I'm going to end this. This will go behind the other shape, so it doesn't really matter where it goes at that point, because it will be hidden anyway. This will go behind that one as well. So if I eyedropper this color, I might have sent it behind the photo. Yeah, there we go. And then you do the same thing for this one. So you could bend a similar shape around here, either drawing it with the pen tool or starting with a rectangle and then distorting it with one of the blends. But it's basically this curve actually. This part on mine isn't quite working because this wants to feel like it's a continuous curve. So this one would actually have to come up more like this, I think. This would then need to disappear behind there. So maybe this angle would have to change a little bit. We might have to curve this bit slightly as well to make it, no, that's not right. This bit might have to come back a little bit, I think. So the angle is more in keeping with it. And then this angle would need to come back. So it's a little bit fiddly, but basically this needs to feel like it's flowing back on itself. So I've got to make this curve flow into there. It might mean coming further down with this. So that feels like a continuous curve around there. And then this curve should echo it. So I might need to add a point here and pull this around like that so that that curve feels like it's coming back on itself. If I go into outline mode, this part right here needs to feel like it's doing that. Does that help? Okay. And then let me take a look at a different one. So that was Aldrich. Is Harrison here? Is Harrison? What do we provide? We provide medical care, research. Is this a made-up company? Okay. Or is it? Who are we? We're a non-profit organization seeking to aid those who have been affected by natural disasters. What do we provide? We provide medical care, search and rescue, clean water, food, and temporary shelters for residents nearby. Where we are located. We are located in areas around the Midwest and the Gulf Coast of the United States. It is so that we are closer to those who are more likely to encounter natural disasters such as hurricanes and tornadoes. History. This non-profit organization started on August 20th, 2021. We were only a small team of 4 but we've grown to over 500 members. Our logo and name is based off of the story of Sadako and the 1,000 paper cranes. Orizuru literally means paper crane. The meaning behind 1,000 paper cranes is said to let those who create them to have a healthy life and recovery. We aim to reach over 1,000 members to fulfill our name, and won't be stopping there. The more help we get, the more people we can help and potentially save. Okay, very good. This is actually really good because it shows you how Harrison has sort of defined what the company is, or in this case, a non-profit organization. He's kind of defining for us what it is, so that when you look at the logos, you can feel if they're in relationship to it. So your logo is going to be basically using the paper crane as a symbol, and then it's a matter of getting the lettering to fit with that, right? Okay. So have you started anything in Illustrator yet? Okay. But you have started drawing something out for it in Illustrator? But you've started drawing some versions of it in Illustrator? Okay, all right, very good. Do you have any questions about it? Like when you were doing it, is there anything you were trying to do what you weren't able to achieve? Yeah, okay. So how would you describe what the font should feel like? Uh-huh. Tell me a little bit of a synopsis, because I've heard the idea of the 1,000 cranes before, but I don't really completely understand the story of it. So the idea is that if you fold 1,000 paper cranes. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because of the nuclear explosion. Yeah. Oh, okay. But it's a more ancient story than that, right? Or you're not sure. Okay. So it's sort of like a ritual that you would do as a way to give you good luck or good fortune. Okay. So it has a kind of it's a very positive sort of message, right? And so I think that your font, I might be wrong about this, but my feeling is that the font should have a friendliness about it. Does that seem right? And so you could think of other adjectives like that to describe what the font would be like. But if you're looking for fonts in that way, here's an approach to it. It's called Orizuru. Did I spell that right? Is this the little girl's name?
No.
No. The company name. Oh, it means crane, right? Yeah, yeah. Okay, so if you are looking for fonts, one suggestion is if you want to have a font which is somewhat friendly, serif fonts feel traditional. So if you wanted it to feel more modern, I would suggest sans serif typefaces. So Myriad, for instance, is a sans serif typeface. So you could start by just simply trying the font out in a few different typefaces. So this is Myriad. If we go to filters over here, I can choose to only show the sans serif typefaces to begin with. So this is din. This is Avenir. This is Gilsans. This is Gilsans regular. So of these sans serif typefaces, this one is the most humanist because it has a calligraphic quality to it. So if you see how it has this thin part of the R here, and also on the U here, it gets a little bit thinner there. There's a slight calligraphic nature to this particular version of the sans serif font. So that tends to feel a little bit more friendly. The only thing with Gilsans is I think that it has a very British feel because it has a lot of associations with Britain. So it's sometimes referred to as the British Helvetica, and it's used by the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. It's also used by the London Underground, or a variation of it actually, is used on the London Underground, and other companies I can't think off the top of my head, but in Britain. So it tends to have that sort of flavour to it. That's the only drawback with that one, I think, for this. But you might find another similar kind of, so if you look up humanist sans serif typeface. So here's some examples, like Optima, for example. Ideal Sans, Ephra, Johnson. There's some examples anyway for you to look at. If you were to look at if you were to look at serif typefaces, it'll have a more kind of traditional feel. But again, you can have fonts which feel sort of friendly, even though they feel traditional. So if you were to search under serif typefaces, you might make another row of these. You know, just take this one again, and then if I take this filter off and put serif faces, we can then look through the various serif typefaces. So this one only comes in a bold or a fat face. The other thing you might try as well is seeing what the different fonts look like when you see them in just lowercase or just uppercase. So if I select that and I go to type, change case, uppercase, we can see it in uppercase. And you might also look at, say, oh, I'm on the serif filters. Let me take the filters off. So if I do Futura, this is a condensed typeface. I think we looked at that at one of those other ones. You looked at Futura. The nice thing about Futura is what's called a geometric sans. It's one of those typefaces that, in its regular form, like this medium, has a very round circular O, and like the bottom of the U is basically a circle, the R is basically a circle. This part is just, it's all straight, it's a triangle, it's rectangles and triangles basically. So the thing that's quite nice about this is it feels very elemental, like very simple. So if you're trying to put across a simple message about your organization, you want your organization to feel clear and simple and kind of maybe even a little bit friendly, because it feels like, I oftentimes think Futura works well for kids because of those geometric shapes. It's almost like building blocks, you know. So that's a thought for sure. That's the bold version. So look at it in both ways. And then also look at the amount of tracking. So the tracking is the space between letters. it changes the look a lot. If you make it very close together, you can have them where they're almost touching or even touching sometimes, you know. It has a very different feel to it than if you were to have it opened up. So if you took that same font, but you then opened up the tracking. I'm just using Option and arrows on the keyboard to adjust the tracking, by the way. So if you're on a PC, it would be Alt, arrows. But you see how that changes the look of it by having it either wide spacing, what they call letter spaced, or having it where the spacing has been removed. When you're doing this, you'd also, particularly if you're coming this close together, you might want to do fine adjustments with what's called kerning. So kerning is the space between two individual characters rather than the overall adjustment. And you might want to go in here and adjust each individual character a little bit so that the spacing is more natural. So the idea, my dad was a graphic designer. He was the head of graphic design at Rolls-Royce in England. And he was the person that first talked to me about kerning and tracking. And the way he talked about it, he said that the best way to think about it is you imagine like in between the letters you're pouring liquid or you're pouring sand. You want it to be roughly the same amount of volume. So some letters have a big space, like the letter Y, capital Y for instance, has a big space on the side because of the shape of it. So you might want that letter to be closer to another letter, which would take up some of that space that it's occupying with the shape of the letter font. So particularly with a logo type, you want to, yeah, go ahead. Well, what I'm talking about is the space. Like, so I'm making fine adjustments to the space between the letters. Like here, I'm actually making the top of this Z touch the U, but at the bottom I have more space because of the way that this particular letter form is formed. Here, yeah. So some of this is obviously subjective, right? It's not like a science. It's more of an art. But basically what I'm doing is I'm trying to make it feel like the space between them feels correct.
So like if say it was like a different word,
Uh-huh.
and so like say for example that I didn't look good touching that Z.
Yeah.
Maybe if it was the ID on another word though, where like say it was like different letters in the R, but it, like the spacing lined up.
Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. It depends on the given situation. Yeah. So that's why this is the tracking setting. So in the character panel, this is the same in Photoshop, same in InDesign, same in Illustrator. By the way, the way that you approach it is the same as well. So there's two settings here. One is the kerning. That's the adjustment of space between two specific characters. And then this is the tracking, which is the space between all of the words within a word or a sentence or a paragraph or the entire story, right? So tracking you might use, like let's say you're doing a newspaper article and it almost fits on the page, but there's a little bit that goes over. You could track all of the lettering back, say -10, and then all of a sudden it all fits onto that page in one article. So that's one reason for tracking. The reason for doing tracking here is a little bit different. We're doing it for stylistic purposes. So by opening the spacing up, Futura is kind of a Art Deco font. So Art Deco is a period in design, around about the 1920s, 1930s. And this font, Futura, was designed, if I remember rightly, 1926, around about there anyway, 1926, 1927, somewhere around there. And so this is a sort of height of the Deco era. It's quite common in Deco design to letter space typography for things like the name of a building. You know, like if you have a hotel, for instance, that's a Deco building, like the Wilshire Hotel in LA is a Deco building. I don't know this, but the Wilshire Hotel, the Wilshire Theatre, I mean, the Wilton Theatre on Wilshire Boulevard, I think it's probably got a sign over it that's got this style of lettering that's letter spaced. And I don't know that from looking at it. I'm assuming that because of the style of architecture it is, that they would oftentimes letter space this, and they would oftentimes use a condensed version of the typeface as well. So you might have something that's more like that actually, where the spacing is quite a lot of spacing in between each of the letters. And then this tends to work, this letter spacing tends to work well with condensed typefaces because the condensed typefaces, the verticals become prominent because they're all sort of squashed close together. And so it helps you to distinguish each individual letter Normally, you don't want to distinguish each individual letter because the way that we read is not quite like that. So if you're reading over distance, the way that we read is we sort of read the first letter, the last letter, and we kind of fudge the middle. So you may have seen this. This is an old advertising campaign. I think it's late 1990s, maybe, somewhere around about there. But there's a clothing company called French Connection UK. And so they made T-shirts that did this. And when you first look at it, because of the way we read, we sort of misread it. Because we read the first letter, the last letter, and then we fudge the bit in the middle. So it sort of looks like it says fuck. But it's French Connection UK is the name of the brand. So it's playing a game with the way that we understand legibility or readability. Legibility, actually. So by letter spacing it would actually make it harder for that to read as a word. So we can then take those individual letters and read it as initials more. So that's an example of how letter spacing can actually work in terms of making it easier for you to read. It doesn't usually. Usually you want the letters to be a little bit close together. The other thing with the logo type is that once you've got a font, it may be that you want to modify it slightly. So you don't necessarily have to do this. Some fonts, some logo types are literally a font that they've just adjusted the kerning and so on. But you might also want to actually modify the shape slightly. So here's some things you could do. If you outline the type, you could, for instance, go, let's take this out. That's a different version of it now. How else could you modify it? You could modify it in a bunch of different ways. I want you to understand that typography is a very, very important part of graphic design. It's one of the two most essential ingredients, along with images and graphics. Typography, which is really images and graphics, let's face it, they're drawings. Each letter form, somebody drew it. We sort of forget that, but you could split the type and rotate it slightly from a point as if it's been broken. That probably wouldn't work with your idea, because remember that the technique that you're using needs to correspond with the idea that you're doing. So what is it that it's expressing? And again, just to reiterate this, do it all in black and white to begin with. You want to design the logo to work just in black and white, so you can have a black and white version of it, and then you can switch it to color. Because if you start working in color, sometimes there'll be parts of the logo that will only work in color. As soon as you make it black and white, it'll kind of fall apart. So I would suggest you just focus on the shapes to begin with. Then you can start thinking about the color a little bit later on. All right, what are we doing for time? It's 8:45. Is that really right? Yeah. All right, so I'm going to let you guys work for a little bit, and I'll come around and help you individually. I'd like to see this logo turned in on Sunday. In fact, I'll rephrase that. So this is due on Sunday at 11:59. You should turn this in, and it's the Illustrator stuff that I want to see first of all. And then remember that you're going to be using this and extending it further. So you can still refine the logo further. And as long as you turn something in on Sunday night, you can always come back and make changes to it for a better grade, okay? Has anybody got questions for me right now? You all okay? All right. Just the logo. Yeah. But when you turn the Illustrator logo in, imagine that you're presenting this to a client. So imagine that I'm your client and you're presenting it. So you might want to present like a vertical version of the logo and a horizontal version of the logo. So if you look at like some of those visual identities that I was showing you earlier, you'll see examples of those. Let's see if I can find it again. Like I think for instance, on the NBC Sports one that I have, the NBC Sports one's not attached for some reason. Which other one has one? Virgin America has one. So this one has a vertical and a horizontal logo. So that's their horizontal one. That's their vertical one. They call it a stacked logo, but same thing, vertical and horizontal. It's pretty common for companies to have those two different versions. And they do tend to specify that this is the preferred version. So with Virgin, for instance, they prefer to have the horizontal one wherever possible. But if there isn't the space for it, they do have a vertical version that they can use instead. Okay, so you could maybe do that. But what is due on Sunday is I want it as part of the logo project. You should have the sketches. So I think you've already turned your sketches in, but you should have sketches. And then I would show a sheet of development in Illustrator, like different versions, modifications, like something like I'm doing here. I've started doing here, where you're just playing around with different ideas. And then after that, upload one which is like the final version. And you could upload one where you have, say, 3 different versions. Normally, if I was doing a logo design for a company, the way that I would approach it is I first of all do an estimate, and I would tell them how much it's going to cost. And I break it down into certain packages. So basically, it would be like, I will do 3 versions of your logo, and then additional changes with 2 rounds of changes. This is a typical one, a typical estimate. It would be, I'll do 3 versions of your logo plus 2 rounds of changes. So that means that they'll look at those 3 versions of the logo, and then they'll go, we kind of like number 2, but I like the font that you're using on number 3, and we'll try a version like that. That would be 1 round of changes, and then maybe we'll come back again, and they'll say, we like it, but can you try it with, a little bit less spacing between the letters or something like that, and we'll try another version. And then after that, I always, if it continues to make lots and lots of changes, because some clients are like that, then we move into I'm charging you by the hour at that point for any additional changes to it. So and then when I present it, the rounds of changes would be like that. I would present them one PDF that shows 3 different versions. I'll also sometimes do it where I just show them the black and white versions once. Then I'll show them color versions of the logo, or different colorways. So they may choose the logo out of 3 black and white versions, and then we'll do, say, 3 versions in color. And then once they've got those 3 color versions, we can nail it down to the colors that we want to use and refine it that way. So for when you present it on Sunday, I should say, do those different versions. So you've got the sketches, initial sketches that you've already uploaded. You've got the different development ideas. So I can see how you are kind of going through the process of developing the ideas. And then finally, maybe 3 different versions of it. They don't have to be drastically different, but do one version, duplicate it, make some changes to it, duplicate it, make some changes to it. So you've got 3 versions you can present. That way, when we look at it and discuss it next week, we have something meaty to discuss. Like, I like that one, but I don't know. There's something about that one that's also kind of interesting. If it was only a little bit lighter or something, Does that help? Okay, cool. I have like this family crisis going on at the moment. Like just before the class started, there was the police around at my house and stuff going on. There's a bit of craziness going on. So if you don't mind, like you can work on stuff for right now. I'm just going to run outside for a minute and make a phone call and see if everything's okay, and I'll come back and help you all individually if I don't need to take off in a quick emergency. Okay, but I think it's probably okay because I would have heard something by now. So give me a 10 minutes. everything's sort of straightened out, so I can stay here. So how did you get on with sorting out your overview?
I appreciate it. I'll definitely go through it.
Yeah, and then if you need to talk before Sunday and you want to meet online, if you're trying to do something you're not quite sure how to do it, send me a message. Do that. So you want to have a gradient that runs through this one, or through the whole thing. So you can stay there, I'll just be on the screen. This is basically what you have, right? If you select all of them like that, these are just rectangles or are they strokes? Do you know what I mean? So it could be that you have like a stroke like this that has thickness to it.
Oh no, yeah,
it's a rectangle.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I select all of those rectangles and then I do unite, so that becomes one shape. You actually don't need to do this, but if you click on Pathfinder, so if you don't see this, you can go to Window, Pathfinder. This is alphabetical. And then the very first one is Unite. So this will combine all of those shapes. If you have them all selected, it will combine them as one shape. And then you could apply the gradient to that. So when you apply the gradient, you need to have the fill in the front. So you see how if I click here, the stroke comes to the front. If I click here, the fill comes to the front. Have the fill in the front, then click on the gradient. And then if you want to redirect the gradient, like you want it going down, you can drag it like that. Do you want it going down or across? You want it going down. So you can drag it like that. Is that what you meant? Something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.